The shovel slipped from Clara Wellington's trembling hands, clattering against the iron rails as her knees buckled beneath the scorching Texas sun. At 18 and nearly 300 pounds, she collapsed onto the railroad ties while her father's workers jeered from the shadows of the freight cars. What the crowd didn't see was Thomas Wellington's face, not the stern mask of a railroad baron, but the anguished expression of a desperate father watching his only child suffer. His foreman stepped forward, whispering urgently, "Sir, she can't take much more of this." Mrs. Henderson from the general store gasped, clutching her shawl as she remembered the vibrant little girl who used to recite poetry in the town square. Now that same child lay broken in the dirt, her dress torn and soaked with sweat. "Get her up," Thomas commanded, his voice cracking despite his effort to sound harsh. Inside, his heart shattered with each labored breath his daughter took. But what the town of Dustwood didn't know was that every brutal hour was born from a father's desperate love and a doctor's terrifying warning that Clara had only months to live. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Dustwood, Texas had been nothing more than a whistle stop on the endless prairie, its population barely reaching 800 souls scattered across sun-baked adobe buildings and weathered wooden storefronts. The arrival of the Wellington Pacific Railroad changed everything. Thomas Wellington's iron horses brought prosperity, jobs, and the promise of civilization to this forgotten corner of the Lone Star State. Thomas Wellington stood 6 feet tall with steel-gray hair and hands calloused from years of honest work before his railroad empire made him the wealthiest man between San Antonio and El Paso. At 45, he commanded respect through quiet authority rather than bluster, his word carrying the weight of law in a town that owed its existence to his vision. But behind his composed exterior lay a man haunted by a tragedy that shaped every decision he made. Clara Wellington possessed her father's sharp mind trapped within a body that society deemed unacceptable. At 18, she weighed nearly 300 pounds, her brilliant intellect overshadowed by whispered conversations about her size. She devoured books with the same appetite that others claimed she had for food, speaking 3 languages fluently and solving mathematical problems that stumped the town's schoolmaster. Yet in 1885, Texas, a woman's worth was measured by her waistline and her ability to bear children, not her capacity for learning. The curse of Clara's condition traced back to her birth when Margaret Wellington died from complications that the local doctor attributed to her obesity. Thomas had watched his beloved wife struggle through 18 hours of labor before her heart simply gave out, leaving him with a daughter who bore the same physical challenges that had claimed his wife's life. The town physician, Dr. Edmund Hayes, regularly reminded Thomas that obesity ran in families like a hereditary sin, claiming it stemmed from moral weakness and lack of self-control. 3 miles outside Dustwood, Jacob Morrison's blacksmith shop stood as a testament to both skill and sorrow. At 24, Jacob possessed the lean strength of a man who earned his living shaping iron with hammer and fire. His sandy hair and green eyes carried an intensity born from loss. 3 years earlier, his parents had perished when a Wellington Railroad bridge collapsed during a spring flood. The official investigation blamed faulty construction materials, but Jacob harbored suspicions that corners had been cut to save money. Cornelius Blackwood's rival railroad company, the Texas Central Line, operated from the neighboring town of Sage Creek, where the 52-year-old industrialist nursed grievances against Wellington's success. Blackwood's own tragedy had struck 2 years prior when his son Henry died in a train derailment that Blackwood blamed on Wellington's aggressive expansion tactics. The loss had transformed a once honorable businessman into a man consumed by thoughts of revenge. These interconnected lives moved through Dustwood like trains on converging tracks, each carrying their burden of grief, ambition, and unspoken truths. The desert wind that swept across the Texas plains seemed to whisper of the collision that was coming, when love and hatred would clash with the force of locomotives meeting head-on in the darkness. The morning of March 20th arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the Texas sky look like polished blue steel. Thomas Wellington sat in Dr. Edmund Hayes's cramped office above the barber shop, his hands gripping his hat brim so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The smell of carbolic acid and old leather filled the air as Dr. Hayes adjusted his spectacles and delivered words that would shatter Thomas's world. 6 months, Dr. Hayes said, his voice carrying the weight of a death sentence. Maybe less if she continues at this rate. Her heart simply cannot sustain the strain much longer. I've seen it before, Thomas. The same condition took your Margaret, and it will take Clara unless drastic measures are employed immediately. Thomas stared at the medical diploma hanging crooked on the wall, fighting to keep his composure. What kind of measures? Vigorous physical labor, reduced food intake, the kind of discipline that will shock her system into shedding the excess weight that's killing her. Dr. Hayes leaned forward, his gray beard trembling with conviction. I know it sounds harsh, but sometimes we must be cruel to be kind. The girl needs to understand that her very life depends on changing her ways. The walk home felt like a death march. Thomas's boots kicked up small clouds of dust as he passed the bustling railroad yard where his workers were loading cattle cars bound for Kansas City. The sight of men performing back-breaking labor under the merciless sun sparked a desperate idea in his mind. If hard work could build railroads and fortunes, perhaps it could save his daughter's life. That evening, Thomas found Clara in the library, surrounded by books as usual. She looked up with the bright smile that never failed to remind him of Margaret, her dark hair catching the lamplight as she marked her place in a volume of Shakespeare. The sight of her trusting face made what he was about to do feel like the cruelest betrayal imaginable. Clara, we need to talk. His voice came out harsher than intended, causing her smile to falter. You'll be starting work at the railroad yard tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock sharp. Clara's book slipped from her hands, landing with a soft thud on the Persian rug. Work? Father, I don't understand. What kind of work? The kind that builds character and strength. You'll be helping load freight cars, cleaning equipment, whatever needs doing. Thomas forced himself to meet her confused gaze, even as his heart screamed in protest. It's time you learned the value of honest labor instead of hiding behind books all day. But, Father, I thought you wanted me to continue my studies. You said education was... I said a lot of things. Thomas turned away, unable to bear the hurt blossoming in her eyes. Report to Foreman Mackenzie at dawn. Don't be late. The first day of Clara's new life began in the gray, pre-dawn darkness, with Thomas watching from his office window as she walked slowly toward the railroad yard. Her white dress stood out like a ghost against the shadows, and Thomas had to grip the windowsill to keep from running after her and calling the whole thing off. Foreman Mackenzie, a gruff Irishman with arms like tree trunks, looked as uncomfortable as Thomas felt when Clara approached the work crew. Miss Wellington, he said, touching his cap awkwardly, your father says you're to help with the freight loading today. The other workers, rough men who smelled of tobacco and sweat, exchanged glances and barely concealed smirks. Clara's face burned with embarrassment as Mackenzie handed her a shovel and pointed toward a pile of coal that needed loading into a tender car. That's enough coal to fill a locomotive, said Pete Garrison, a rail worker with missing teeth and a cruel laugh. Might take her all week to move it, boss. Clara's first shovelful of coal felt like it weighed 50 pounds. Her soft hands, accustomed only to turning book pages, began to blister within the first hour. By noon, her dress was black with coal dust, and sweat had plastered her hair to her forehead. The workers' initial amusement had given way to something approaching pity. but they continued their work without offering help. From his office window, Thomas watched his daughter struggle and felt pieces of his soul breaking away like paint peeling from weathered wood. When she stumbled and nearly fell while carrying a heavy water bucket, he had to physically restrain himself from running to her aid. This was love, he told himself. This was the only way to save her life, even if it meant she would hate him forever. As the sun reached its merciless peak, Clara's legs gave out completely. She collapsed beside the coal pile, her chest heaving as she fought for breath in the suffocating heat. The sight of his daughter's suffering finally broke Thomas's resolve, and he started toward the door, only to be stopped by the memory of Dr. Hayes's words echoing in his mind. 6 months, maybe less. The screech of the 5:15 freight train's whistle had become Clara's signal of defeat. For 3 weeks she had endured the back-breaking labor at the railroad yard, her body growing leaner but her spirit withering like tumbleweeds in the desert wind. Each evening, she returned home covered in coal dust and shame, unable to understand why her father, who had once called her his brightest star, now treated her like a common laborer deserving of public humiliation. On the morning of April 15th, Clara made a decision that would forever alter the course of 3 lives. Instead of reporting to Foreman Mackenzie at dawn, she walked past the railroad yard and continued toward the gleaming steel tracks that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The metal rails caught the early sunlight like silver ribbons, and Clara found herself thinking about her mother, whom she had never known, but whose presence she felt in every disappointed glance from her father. She positioned herself between the rails, her white nightgown billowing in the morning breeze as she closed her eyes and listened for the approaching thunder of the westbound freight train. The vibration in the steel beneath her bare feet grew stronger, and with it came a strange sense of peace. If her father could no longer love her as she was, perhaps it was better to join her mother in whatever realm awaited beyond this world of endless judgment and impossible expectations. The train's whistle shrieked its warning as the massive locomotive rounded the bend, black smoke pouring from its stack like the breath of some iron dragon. Clara kept her eyes closed, thinking of all the books she would never read, all the conversations she would never have, all the love she would never experience. The ground shook violently now, and she could hear the screaming of brakes as the engineer spotted her figure on the tracks. Strong arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her from the rails just as the freight train thundered past in a blur of steel and steam. Clara found herself pressed against a man's chest, his heart beating rapidly against her cheek as they tumbled into the tall grass beside the tracks. When she opened her eyes, she was looking into the green gaze of Jacob Morrison, the blacksmith whose parents had died in the bridge collapse 3 years earlier. "What in God's name were you thinking?" Jacob's voice was rough with adrenaline and anger as he helped her sit up. "That train would have scattered you across 3 counties. Clara's tears came then, great sobbing gasps that shook her entire body. "You don't understand. Nobody understands. My father hates me. The whole town laughs at me. I'm nothing but a burden to everyone I meet." Jacob studied her face, seeing something beyond the tears and desperation that surprised him. Despite everything he had planned to say to a Wellington if he ever encountered one alone, despite all his carefully nursed hatred for the family that had destroyed his own, he found himself looking at a young woman whose pain cut deeper than his desire for revenge. "Your father doesn't hate you," Jacob said quietly, offering her his handkerchief. "I've seen him watching you work. The man looks like he's dying inside every time you lift that shovel." "Then why?" Clara's voice broke on the question. "Why does he force me to endure this humiliation? I used to read to him every evening. We would discuss philosophy and literature until late into the night. Now he barely looks at me, and when he does, I see only disappointment." Jacob helped her to her feet, noting how her nightgown hung looser on her frame than it would have a month ago. Maybe he's trying to save you from something worse than hard work. Maybe he's fighting a battle you can't see. They walked slowly back toward town, Clara's bare feet picking carefully through the prairie grass while Jacob maintained a respectful distance. The sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded Clara of happier mornings when her father would lift her onto his shoulders to watch the sunrise from their front porch. "Why did you save me?" Clara asked as they reached the outskirts of Dustwood. "Your parents died because of my father's railroad. You have every right to hate our family." Jacob paused, his jaw working as he struggled with emotions he hadn't expected to feel. "Because watching someone destroy themselves doesn't bring back the dead. And because—" he met her eyes directly. "Because you're not your father, and I'm tired of carrying hatred around like a millstone." As they approached the Wellington house, Thomas burst through the front door, his face wild with panic. He had discovered Clara's empty bed and immediately feared the worst, spending the last hour searching the town with a growing sense of dread. When he saw his daughter walking beside Jacob Morrison, relief and rage warred across his features. "Clara, where have you been? I've had half the town looking for—" Thomas stopped mid-sentence as he took in her appearance, the nightgown, the grass stains, the tear-streaked face, and most significantly, the gentle way Jacob was guarding her from stumbling. "She was on the railroad tracks, Mr. Wellington," Jacob said simply. "The 5:15 freight nearly killed her." The color drained from Thomas's face as the full implication hit him. His desperate attempt to save his daughter's life had nearly driven her to end it herself. He looked from Clara's haunted expression to Jacob's steady gaze. And for the first time since Dr. Hayes had delivered his terrible diagnosis, Thomas Wellington felt the crushing weight of his own failure as a father. "Get away from my daughter," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was looking at the man who had just saved Clara's life, the son of the couple whose deaths had haunted Thomas's conscience for 3 years. Clara stepped closer to Jacob, a gesture that spoke louder than words. "He saved me, Father, when no one else could." The weeks that followed Clara's near-death experience brought a subtle but unmistakable shift to the rhythms of Dustwood. Thomas had forbidden his daughter from seeing Jacob Morrison, but love has a way of finding paths around even the most determined obstacles. Clara discovered that the route from the railroad yard to the blacksmith shop was only a 5-minute detour, easily explained as a necessary stop for equipment repairs. Jacob's forge became Clara's sanctuary during the brief respites from her labor. The ring of hammer on anvil created a rhythm that seemed to match her heartbeat, and the honest work Jacob performed with his hands stood in stark contrast to the meaningless drudgery her father forced upon her. In the dancing flames of the forge fire, Clara found a warmth that had been missing from her life since her father's inexplicable transformation from loving parent to harsh taskmaster. "Tell me about the bridge," Clara said one afternoon in early May, watching Jacob shape a horseshoe with practiced precision. "Tell me what really happened to your parents." Jacob's hammer paused mid-strike, and Clara could see the muscles in his shoulders tense beneath his work shirt. "Your father told the investigation it was faulty materials, said the supplier in Dallas had sold him substandard iron." He resumed hammering, each blow more forceful than the last. "But my father helped build that bridge. He knew good iron from bad, and he would have spoken up if something wasn't right." "Then what do you think happened?" Jacob set down his hammer and looked directly at her, his green eyes reflecting the forge fire. "I think your father was rushing to meet a deadline. I think he pushed the work crews too hard and cut corners to save time and money. And I think when that bridge collapsed with my parents on it, he covered up the truth to protect his reputation." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. The father who had once taught her about honor and integrity, who had instilled in her a love of truth and justice through their evening discussions of philosophy, could he really be capable of such deception? Yet as she thought about his recent behavior, his willingness to subject her to public humiliation for reasons he refused to explain, she found herself wondering if she had ever truly known Thomas Wellington at all. Their conversations grew longer as Clara's body slowly adapted to the physical demands of her work. The excess weight that had plagued her since childhood began to melt away under the relentless Texas sun, and with it came a confidence she had never possessed. Jacob noticed the change not just in her appearance but in the way she carried herself, the way she spoke with increasing conviction about topics that mattered to her. "You're different than I expected," Jacob admitted one evening as they sat beside the creek that ran behind his shop. The water gurgled peacefully over smooth stones and fireflies danced among the cottonwood trees. "When I first saw you at the railroad yard, I thought you were just another spoiled rich girl getting her comeuppance." Clara laughed, a sound that surprised them both with its lightness. "And now? Now I think you're the strongest person I've ever met. To endure what your father puts you through every day and still find reasons to smile." Jacob picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the water's surface. Most people would have broken by now. The weight of his words settled between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Clara had never thought of herself as strong, quite the opposite in fact. She had always felt weak, inadequate, unable to meet the standards that society and her father demanded, but seeing herself reflected in Jacob's eyes, she began to wonder if perhaps strength came in forms she had never recognized. Meanwhile, from his office window overlooking the railroad yard, Thomas watched his daughter's transformation with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Dr. Hayes had been right about the effects of hard labor. Clara had lost nearly 40 pounds since March, and her movements had gained a vitality that had been absent for years. But the cost of this physical improvement was becoming increasingly clear. The light that had once shone in Clara's eyes when she looked at her father had dimmed to barely glowing embers. Thomas's private torment was witnessed only by his foreman, Patrick Mackenzie, who had worked for the Wellington family for over a decade. Mackenzie found his employer in the office one evening long after the other workers had gone home, staring at a photograph of Clara and Margaret taken just months before Margaret's death. "She's getting stronger, Mr. Wellington," Mackenzie offered carefully. "Lost more weight in these past weeks than I've seen anyone manage." "She hates me, Patrick." Thomas's voice was barely audible above the sound of wind whistling through the railroad yard. "My own daughter looks at me like I'm a stranger. Sometimes I catch her watching me, and I can see her trying to figure out what happened to the father who used to read her bedtime stories." "Maybe it's time to tell her the truth, sir. About what Dr. Hayes said. About why you're doing this." Thomas shook his head slowly. "If I tell her she's dying, she'll give up hope. And if I tell her I'm doing this because I love her, she'll think I'm lying. Either way, I lose her." He set the photograph back on his desk with hands that trembled slightly. "At least this way, she might live long enough to forgive me someday." What Thomas didn't know was that his activities were being observed by someone with far more sinister intentions than mere workplace gossip. Cornelius Blackwood had been conducting his own investigation into the Wellington family's vulnerabilities, and Clara's relationship with Jacob Morrison presented an opportunity too perfect to ignore. Blackwood's visits to Dustwood had become more frequent in recent weeks, always under the guise of legitimate business dealings. He would arrive on the morning train from Sage Creek, conduct meetings with local merchants and ranchers, and inevitably find reasons to linger near the railroad yard or the blacksmith shop. His practiced eye took in every detail, the way Clara's face lit up when she saw Jacob, the protective stance Jacob assumed whenever other men looked at Clara with less than respectful interest, and most importantly, the growing rift between father and daughter that Blackwood could exploit. On a particularly warm afternoon in late May, Blackwood finally made his move. He found Clara sitting alone behind the equipment shed during her brief lunch break, her face flushed from the morning's labor and her hands wrapped around a simple meal of bread and cheese. She looked up in surprise as his shadow fell across her small patch of shade. "Miss Wellington, isn't it?" Blackwood's voice carried the smooth polish of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through charm rather than force. "Cornelius Blackwood, at your service. I own the Texas Central line over in Sage Creek." Clara recognized the name, her father's primary business rival, and instinctively grew wary. Mr. Blackwood. "I'm afraid my father isn't here if you're looking to conduct business. Actually, it's you I wanted to speak with." Blackwood settled himself on a nearby crate with the easy familiarity of someone accustomed to making himself at home anywhere. "I've been hearing disturbing reports about your treatment here. A young lady of your breeding, forced to perform manual labor like a common field hand." "My father believes the work is good for me," Clara replied carefully, though something in Blackwood's sympathetic tone made her defenses weaken slightly. "Does he now?" Blackwood's smile held no warmth. "And what do you believe, Miss Wellington? Do you think a loving father would subject his only child to public humiliation and backbreaking labor? Or might there be other reasons for such unusual behavior?" Clara felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. The questions that had been haunting her for months suddenly found voice through this stranger's probing words. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." Blackwood leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I think you've been wondering why a man who once cherished you above all else now treats you with such apparent cruelty. I think you've begun to suspect that perhaps your father's affections were never as genuine as you believed." The words hit Clara like physical blows, each one confirming fears she had tried desperately to suppress. "My father loves me," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Does he? Then why hasn't he told you about the bridge collapse that killed young Morrison's parents? Why hasn't he mentioned that I have documents proving he knew the bridge was unsafe, but ordered the work to continue anyway?" Blackwood watched Clara's face carefully, noting the way her complexion paled. "Your father is a man who puts profit before people, Miss Wellington. Always has been. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" As Clara sat in stunned silence, processing this devastating revelation about her father's character, Blackwood delivered his final calculated blow. "There's something else you should know. Your friend Morrison, he's been receiving money from your father. Monthly payments for the past 3 years. I wonder why a guilty man might feel compelled to make such payments to the son of people he accidentally killed through negligence." The confrontation that would shatter the last remnants of the Wellington family came on a sweltering August morning when the heat shimmered like liquid mercury above the railroad tracks. Clara had spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with Blackwood's revelations, her mind cycling endlessly between disbelief and a growing certainty that everything she had believed about her father was a carefully constructed lie. The weight of this knowledge sat heavier on her chest than the physical burden of her daily labor ever had. She found Thomas in his office, bent over ledgers that detailed the financial empire built on iron and steam. The morning sun streaming through the windows illuminated the gray that had crept into his hair over the past months, making him look older than his 45 years. When he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, his face immediately shifted into the mask of stern authority he had worn for so many weeks. "You're supposed to be loading freight cars, not standing around my office," Thomas said, but Clara caught the slight tremor in his voice that betrayed his exhaustion. "I know about the bridge." Clara's words fell into the room like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that seemed to reach every corner. "I know about Jacob's parents, and I know about the money you've been sending him." Thomas's pen clattered to the desk, spattering ink across the neat columns of figures. The careful composure he had maintained for months crumbled in an instant, leaving behind a man who looked as if he had aged a decade in the space of a heartbeat. "Clara, you don't understand. I understand perfectly." Clara stepped into the office, closing the door behind her with deliberate force. "I understand that you killed Jacob's parents through your negligence and then covered it up to protect your precious reputation. I understand that you've been paying him blood money to keep quiet about it, and I understand that everything I believed about your character was nothing but an elaborate deception." "That's not how it happened." Thomas surged to his feet, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Yes, I've been sending money to Jacob, but not to silence him. I've been trying to make amends for something that was genuinely an accident. The bridge collapse. It was faulty materials from the supplier in Dallas. I had no way of knowing." "Stop lying to me." Clara's voice rose to match his, years of suppressed frustration and confusion finally finding release. "Cornelius Blackwood showed me the documents. He has proof that you knew the iron was substandard but used it anyway to meet your deadline. How many other corners have you cut? How many other people have died so that Thomas Wellington could build his railroad empire?" The mention of Blackwood's name sent a chill through Thomas that had nothing to do with the temperature. He moved around the desk toward his daughter, his hands outstretched in a gesture of pleading. "Clara, whatever Blackwood told you, whatever he showed you, it's lies. The man has been trying to destroy our family for years. He's been trying to bring a murderer to justice." Clara backed away from her father's approach, her eyes blazing with a fury that transformed her entire appearance. "And now I understand why you've been treating me like a prisoner and a servant. You can't stand to look at me because I remind you of your crimes. You hate me because I represent everything weak and shameful about yourself. I could never hate you." Thomas's voice broke completely, the careful control he had maintained for so long finally shattering. "Clara, everything I've done, every harsh word, every moment of what must seem like cruelty, it's all been to save your life. Dr. Hayes told me you had 6 months to live if you didn't lose weight. I've been killing myself watching you suffer, but I thought if I could make you strong enough, healthy enough—" More lies. Clara's laugh held no humor, only bitter acknowledgment of what she saw as her father's final betrayal. "You're so accustomed to deception that you can't even be honest about your hatred for your own daughter." The office door burst open, and Jacob Morrison strode in without ceremony, his face grim with purpose. Behind him stood Cornelius Blackwood, wearing an expression of cold satisfaction that should have warned everyone present of the trap that was closing around them. "Clara," Jacob said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "is it true? Has your father been sending me money all these years?" Clara turned to face the man she had grown to love, seeing in his eyes the same sense of betrayal that was tearing her own heart apart. "He's been paying you to keep quiet about the bridge, about what really happened to your parents." Jacob's hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment Thomas thought the younger man might strike him. 3 years, Jacob said through gritted teeth. 3 years I've been taking money from the man who killed my parents, thinking it was charity from a guilty conscience. But it was hush money all along." "No," Thomas said desperately, looking between his daughter and the young man whose respect he had hoped to earn. "Jacob, I sent that money because I genuinely wanted to help you rebuild your life. Yes, I felt responsible for your parents' deaths, but not because I caused them deliberately." The bridge collapse was a tragedy, but it wasn't murder. Blackwood stepped forward, producing a leather portfolio from inside his coat. "Perhaps these documents will help clarify the situation," he said smoothly, withdrawing several official-looking papers. "Railroad Commission reports, engineering assessments, correspondence between Mr. Wellington and his suppliers. All of it proves conclusively that Thomas Wellington knowingly used substandard materials in the construction of the Sage Creek Bridge." "Where did you get those?" Thomas demanded. But even as he asked the question, He could see the doubt blooming in Clara's eyes and the cold fury crystallizing in Jacob's expression. "The same place any concerned citizen obtains evidence of criminal negligence," Blackwood replied. "Through proper legal channels and thorough investigation. Unlike some people, I believe in the importance of truth and accountability." Clara took the documents from Blackwood's hands, scanning the official letterhead and technical details that seemed to confirm everything she had been told. The papers described substandard iron shipments, rushed construction schedules, and safety concerns that had been dismissed in favor of meeting deadlines. At the bottom of several pages, she found her father's signature authorizing the work to proceed despite the warnings. "My God," Clara whispered, the papers trembling in her hands. "It's all true. You really did kill them." "Clara, please." Thomas reached toward his daughter one more time, but she recoiled from his touch as if he carried some contagious disease. "Let me explain what really happened. Those documents don't tell the whole story." "They tell enough," Jacob interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "They tell me that you've been making a fool of me for 3 years. Taking your blood money and believing your lies about wanting to help. Did you enjoy watching me struggle with my conscience about accepting charity from you? Did it amuse you to see me torn between pride and necessity? Jacob, I swear to you on my wife's grave, I never meant—" "Don't." Jacob's single word cut through the air like a blade. "Don't you dare invoke your wife's memory to justify this, and don't pretend you ever cared about me or my family. We were just obstacles to your ambition, and when we got in your way, you removed us." Clara folded the documents with shaking hands and placed them carefully in her apron pocket. When she looked up at her father, her expression held a finality that made Thomas's blood turn to ice water in his veins. "I'm leaving," she said simply. "I'm going with Mr. Blackwood, and I'm going to help him ensure that you face justice for what you've done." "Clara, no." "Whatever Blackwood has promised you, whatever he's told you about justice, it's not about justice at all. It's about revenge." Thomas's voice carried a desperation that made him sound like a drowning man calling for help. "He's using you to destroy me. And once he's accomplished that, he'll discard you without a second thought." Blackwood placed a protective hand on Clara's shoulder, and Thomas noticed how his daughter didn't pull away from the older man's touch the way she had recoiled from his own. "Miss Wellington will be perfectly safe in my care," Blackwood said. "Unlike some people, I know how to treat a young lady with the respect and dignity she deserves." As Clara walked toward the office door with Blackwood beside her, Thomas made one final desperate plea. "Clara, if you've ever loved me, if any part of you still believes I'm your father and not the monster you think I am, please don't leave with him. Something isn't right about this whole situation. Those documents, the timing of his appearance, the way he's manipulating both of you." Clara paused at the threshold, and for a moment Thomas dared to hope that some fragment of their old relationship might save them both. But when she turned back to face him, her eyes held only the cold emptiness of complete disappointment. "I did love you, Father, more than anything in this world. But that was before I learned what kind of man you really are." The journey to Cornelius Blackwood's estate in Sage Creek should have taken 2 hours by train, but mechanical problems with the locomotive stretched the trip into a nightmare of grinding metal and billowing steam that seemed to echo the turmoil in Clara's heart. She sat in Blackwood's private car, watching the Texas landscape blur past the windows while trying to reconcile the father she had loved with the man she now believed him to be. The luxury of Blackwood's accommodations, velvet seats, crystal decanters, and polished brass fixtures, stood in stark contrast to the simple life she had known, yet somehow felt hollow and cold. Jacob had chosen to ride in the regular passenger car, claiming he needed time to think, but Clara suspected he simply couldn't bear to look at her. The revelation that he had been accepting money from her father had shattered something fundamental in his proud spirit, and she could see the shame eating away at him like acid. Every attempt she made to bridge the gap between them met with polite but distant responses that cut deeper than any angry words could have. Blackwood's estate sprawled across 500 acres of prime Texas rangeland, with a mansion that dwarfed even the Wellington family home. As their carriage rolled up the circular drive, Clara couldn't help but notice the armed guards positioned at strategic points around the property, their rifles gleaming in the afternoon sun. When she questioned Blackwood about the heavy security, he merely smiled and explained that a man in his position made many enemies in the course of business. "You'll be perfectly safe here, my dear," Blackwood assured her as they climbed the front steps toward an imposing set of double doors carved with intricate designs. "I have guest quarters prepared that will provide you with all the comfort and privacy you need while we prepare our case against your father." The guest quarters turned out to be an entire wing of the mansion, complete with sitting room, bedroom, and private bath. Clara had never seen such opulence, but the beauty of her surroundings couldn't dispel the growing unease that had been building since they left Dustwood. Something about Blackwood's manner had shifted during the journey. His concern for her welfare had taken on an intensity that felt more possessive than protective. That evening, Blackwood invited Clara and Jacob to dine with him in the mansion's formal dining room. The table could have seated 20 people, but the three of them occupied only one end, creating an intimacy that felt forced and uncomfortable. Blackwood dominated the conversation, regaling them with stories of his late son Henry and the bright future the young man had possessed before Thomas Wellington's negligence cut his life short. "Henry was going to be a doctor," Blackwood said, his voice taking on the reverent tone reserved for speaking of the dead. "He had already been accepted to medical school in Chicago, but all of that ended when your father's bridge collapsed and sent my boy's carriage tumbling into the ravine." Clara felt the familiar pang of guilt that had become her constant companion since learning of her father's crimes. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mr. Blackwood. If there's anything I can do to help you find justice—" "There is," Blackwood interrupted, his hand reaching across the table to cover hers. "Tomorrow we'll be meeting with the federal marshal to present our evidence against your father. Your testimony will be crucial in securing a conviction." Jacob looked up from his untouched plate, his expression troubled. "What kind of testimony?" Clara wasn't involved in the bridge construction. She would have been 15 years old when it happened. "Ah, but she can speak to her father's character," Blackwood explained smoothly. "She can describe how he treated her, how he showed no remorse for his actions, how he continued to profit from his criminal enterprise while the families of his victims suffered in poverty." Something cold settled in Clara's stomach as she realized the implications of what Blackwood was asking. "You want me to testify that my father is a heartless criminal based on the way he made me work at the railroad yard?" "Among other things, yes." Blackwood's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "A man who would subject his own daughter to public humiliation and physical hardship is clearly capable of any atrocity." Clara pulled her hand free, the pieces of a disturbing puzzle beginning to fall into place. "But you don't know why he made me work there. You don't know about Dr. Hayes or the diagnosis or—" "What diagnosis?" Jacob's voice cut through her words like a whip crack. Clara realized too late that she had revealed something Thomas had begged her to keep secret. The weight of her father's private anguish, which she had dismissed as manipulation and lies, suddenly felt crushing. "Dr. Hayes told him I was dying, that I had 6 months to live if I didn't lose weight. He thought the hard work would save my life." The silence that followed her revelation stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Jacob stared at her with an expression of dawning comprehension, while Blackwood's face darkened with something that looked dangerously close to rage. "You never mentioned this before," Blackwood said, his voice deceptively calm. "This changes the nature of your father's actions considerably." I didn't think it mattered, Clara said weakly, though she was beginning to realize how much it actually did matter. I thought he was lying to manipulate me. And now? Jacob asked quietly. Clara closed her eyes, remembering the look of anguish on her father's face when she had collapsed at the railroad yard, the way his hands had trembled when he thought she couldn't see. Now, I don't know what to believe anymore. Blackwood stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor with a sound like fingernails on slate. I think it's time we discussed the true nature of our arrangement, Miss Wellington. His tone had shifted from paternal concern to something much colder and more calculating. You see, I've invested considerable time and resources in bringing your father to justice, and I'm not about to let sentimentality derail my plans. What do you mean? Clara asked, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to know the answer. I mean that tomorrow you will testify exactly as I've instructed, regardless of your recent doubts about your father's motivations. You will paint him as the monster I know him to be, and you will help me secure the conviction that will destroy him utterly. Blackwood's mask of civility had completely fallen away, revealing the cold fury that lay beneath. Because if you don't, I'm afraid something unfortunate might happen to your friend Mr. Morrison here. Jacob half rose from his chair, but two armed men had appeared in the dining room doorway, their rifles trained on him with practiced precision. You bastard, Jacob snarled. This was all a setup from the beginning. Not a setup, Blackwood corrected. Simply a carefully orchestrated plan to achieve justice by any means necessary. Your father took my son from me, Miss Wellington, and now I'm going to take everything from him. His reputation, his business, his freedom, and most importantly, his daughter. Clara felt the room spinning around her as the full scope of Blackwood's deception became clear. You never cared about justice at all. You just wanted revenge. Justice and revenge are often the same thing, Blackwood replied. The only difference is which side of the equation you happen to occupy. As the guards escorted Jacob from the dining room at gunpoint, Clara found herself truly alone for the first time since leaving Dustwood. The luxury of her surroundings now felt like the gilded bars of an elegant prison, and she realized with growing horror that she had allowed her hurt and anger to blind her to the truth about both the men who claimed to love her. Outside her window, she could see the lights of Dustwood twinkling in the distance like fallen stars. Somewhere in that cluster of buildings, her father was probably sitting in his office, staring at the empty railroad yard and wondering if his daughter would ever forgive him for the terrible choices he had made in the name of love. For the first time since learning about the bridge collapse and the payments to Jacob, Clara began to question everything Blackwood had told her. If he had lied about his motivations, what else might he have fabricated? And if her father really had been trying to save her life through those agonizing months of hard labor, what did that say about the documents that seemed to prove his guilt? As night fell over the Texas prairie, Clara Wellington realized she had made the most catastrophic mistake of her young life, and she had no idea how to undo the damage she had already caused. The sound of breaking glass shattered the pre-dawn stillness as Clara used a heavy brass candlestick to smash the window of her luxurious prison. The sharp edges caught the moonlight like jagged teeth, but she wrapped her nightgown around her hands and carefully climbed through the opening, dropping into the rose garden below. The thorns tore at her bare feet and thin cotton gown, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the agony of knowing she had betrayed the one person who had truly loved her. Her escape from Blackwood's estate proved easier than expected, largely because the guards were focused on keeping people out rather than keeping prisoners in. Clara made her way across the darkened rangeland on foot, following the railroad tracks that gleamed like silver ribbons in the starlight. Each step took her closer to Dustwood and further from the terrible mistake that had nearly cost her everything she held dear. Dawn was breaking over the horizon when Clara finally stumbled into her father's office, her feet bloody and her nightgown torn beyond repair. Thomas looked up from his desk where he had spent the entire night poring over documents and correspondence, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and grief. When he saw his daughter standing in the doorway, he thought for a moment that his sleepless mind was conjuring hallucinations. "Clara?" Thomas rose slowly from his chair, afraid that any sudden movement might cause this vision of his daughter to vanish. "My God, what happened to you? Where have you been?" "Father, I'm so sorry." Clara's voice broke completely as she collapsed into his arms, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I'm sorry I left with him. I'm sorry for everything." Thomas held his daughter with trembling hands, scarcely daring to believe that she had returned to him. The scent of her hair, the weight of her body against his chest, the warmth of her tears soaking through his shirt, all of it felt like a miracle he had never dared hope for. "You came back," he whispered, his own voice thick with emotion. "After everything I put you through, after all the pain I caused you, you came back." "You were trying to save my life," Clara said, pulling back to look into her father's eyes. "Dr. Hayes told you I was dying, and you thought the hard work would make me strong enough to survive. That's why you made me work at the railroad yard. That's why you seemed so cruel. You were fighting to keep me alive." Thomas cupped his daughter's face in his hands, seeing in her eyes the return of the trust and love he had thought lost forever. "Every day I watched you suffer was like a knife in my heart, but I was so afraid of losing you the way I lost your mother. I couldn't bear the thought of standing over another grave, mourning another Wellington woman who died too young." "And the bridge?" Clara asked quietly. "What really happened with Jacob's parents?" Thomas sank back into his chair, pulling Clara down beside him. The morning light streaming through the window illuminated the documents scattered across his desk: engineering reports, correspondence with suppliers, and most importantly, a thick folder marked Sage Creek Bridge Investigation. "The iron was defective," Thomas said, opening the folder to reveal page after page of technical analysis. "But I didn't know it at the time. The supplier in Dallas had been providing quality materials for 2 years, and I had no reason to suspect this shipment was different. When the bridge collapsed, I blamed myself because I was the one who had hired the supplier, chosen the construction crew, approved the timeline. In my mind, I was responsible even if I hadn't been negligent." Clara studied the documents, noting dates and technical specifications that painted a very different picture from the papers Blackwood had shown her. "But what about the documents Mr. Blackwood had? The ones that showed you knew the iron was substandard?" "Forgeries," Thomas said grimly. "Very sophisticated ones, but forgeries nonetheless. Blackwood has been planning this revenge for years, and he's had plenty of time to create false evidence. The real question is how he got access to our company letterhead and my signature to forge them." A cold realization washed over Clara as she remembered something Blackwood had said during their journey. He mentioned having documents from proper legal channels and thorough investigation. "Father, what if he's been working with someone inside the Railroad Commission? Someone who could provide him with authentic letterhead and access to your correspondence?" Thomas's expression darkened as the implications became clear. "Commissioner Bradley. He's been pushing for increased regulation of the railroad industry, and he's never hidden his resentment of successful independent operators like myself. If Blackwood could promise him a way to bring down Wellington Pacific, Bradley might be willing to help fabricate evidence." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation, and through the window they could see a large group of riders approaching the railroad yard. At the head of the group rode Cornelius Blackwood, his face set in lines of cold fury. Behind him came a dozen armed men, and most ominously a man wearing the badge of a federal marshal. "He's come for you," Clara whispered, fear making her voice tremble. He's going to arrest you based on the forged documents." Thomas stood and walked to the window, his shoulders squaring with the resolve of a man who had decided to face his fate head-on. "Then I'll meet him outside. I won't have armed men in the place where you work." "No!" Clara grabbed her father's arm, her grip desperate. "Don't you see? This is exactly what he wants. He's going to have you arrested. And then he'll claim I'm under his protection as a material witness. Once you're in custody, there'll be no one to challenge his story. Then, what do you suggest we do?" Before Clara could answer, the office door burst open and Jacob Morrison strode in, his clothes torn and his face bearing the marks of recent violence. Blood trickled from a cut above his left eye, and his knuckles were scraped raw from what had clearly been a desperate fight. "They're coming," Jacob announced without preamble. "Blackwood has a federal warrant for your arrest, and he's got half the county sheriff's department with him. But there's something else you need to know." He looked directly at Thomas, his green eyes burning with intensity. "I found Henry Blackwood's grave." Clara gasped, understanding immediately what Jacob was implying. I mean Henry Blackwood didn't die in any bridge collapse," Jacob continued. "He's buried in the Sage Creek Cemetery with a headstone that says he died of pneumonia in 1882, a full year before the bridge accident that supposedly killed him." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Thomas staggered slightly, gripping the edge of his desk for support. "Then everything Blackwood told us about his motivation was a lie from beginning to end," Jacob finished. "This isn't about revenge for his son's death. This is about something else entirely. Something worth forging documents and bribing federal officials and kidnapping people to achieve." Clara's mind raced as she tried to piece together the true scope of Blackwood's deception. The railroad. He doesn't just want revenge, he wants to take over Wellington Pacific. If you're arrested and convicted, your assets would be seized to pay damages to the victims' families. And who would be there to buy up the railroad at a fraction of its true value? "Cornelius Blackwood," Thomas said grimly, "the grieving father seeking justice for his poor dead son." Through the window they could see the mounted men spreading out to surround the railroad yard. Blackwood himself had dismounted and was speaking with the federal marshal, pointing toward the office building where Thomas Wellington waited. In a matter of minutes, the trap that had been years in the making would finally close. "There's a back way out through the freight yard," Jacob said urgently. "If we move now, we might be able to reach the sheriff in the next county before Blackwood realizes you're gone." But Thomas shook his head, his jaw set with determination. "No more running, no more hiding from the truth." He turned to Clara, taking her hands in his. "I've spent months trying to save your life by forcing you to endure hardship you didn't understand. Now I'm going to save your future by facing the lies Blackwood has built around us. Father, please, listen to me, Clara. In my desk drawer, there's a metal box with documents that prove everything I've told you about the bridge collapse. Take them to Judge Harrison in Austin. He's an honest man who won't be swayed by Blackwood's influence. And whatever happens to me, know that every harsh word, every moment of pain I caused you, came from a love so deep I was willing to let you hate me if it meant keeping you alive." The sound of boots on the wooden steps outside told them their time had run out. Clara threw her arms around her father one last time, memorizing the feeling of his embrace, while Jacob positioned himself near the window to watch for any opportunity to escape with the evidence. As the office door splintered under the impact of rifle butts and armed men poured into the room, Clara realized that the next few minutes would determine not just her father's fate, but the future of everyone she loved. The truth was finally within reach, but would they live long enough to share it with the world? The federal marshal who entered Thomas Wellington's office bore the weathered face of a man who had spent decades enforcing law on the Texas frontier, but his eyes held an uncertainty that suggested he was not entirely comfortable with his current mission. Marshal William Hayes, no relation to the local doctor, removed his hat as he surveyed the scene before him. Thomas, standing protectively in front of his daughter, Jacob positioned near the window with the coiled tension of a man ready to fight, and Cornelius Blackwood hovering in the doorway like a vulture waiting for carrion. "Thomas Wellington," Marshal Hayes announced in a voice that carried across the room, "I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of criminal negligence resulting in death, conspiracy to conceal evidence, and obstruction of justice in connection with the collapse of the Sage Creek Bridge." "Marshal," Thomas replied calmly, though Clara could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, "I assume you've reviewed the evidence supporting these charges?" "I've seen the documents Mr. Blackwood provided," Hayes replied, but something in his tone suggested less than complete confidence in their authenticity. "Engineering reports, correspondence with suppliers, testimony from witnesses. It appears to be a substantial case." Jacob stepped forward, his hand moving toward the metal box on Thomas's desk. "Marshal, before you make any arrests, there's something you need to see. Evidence that proves those documents are forgeries." "Stay where you are!" Blackwood's voice cracked like a whip as two of his hired guns appeared in the doorway behind him, their rifles trained on Jacob. "Marshal Hayes, I must insist that you take Mr. Wellington into custody immediately. Every moment of delay allows him to further tamper with evidence." But Clara had been studying Marshal Hayes's face during this exchange, and she recognized something in his expression that gave her hope. "Marshal," she said, stepping forward despite her father's protective gesture, "may I ask how long you've been investigating this case?" Hayes looked surprised by the question. "The federal warrant was issued 3 days ago based on evidence provided by Mr. Blackwood's attorneys. Prior to that, I was unaware that any federal crimes had been committed." 3 days, Clara repeated, looking meaningfully at Jacob. "And in those 3 days, did you have an opportunity to interview any witnesses other than those provided by Mr. Blackwood? Did you visit the site of the bridge collapse? Did you examine the original engineering reports filed with the State Railroad Commission?" Marshal Hayes's expression grew thoughtful. "Miss Wellington, are you suggesting that the evidence I've been provided is somehow incomplete?" "I'm suggesting it's completely fabricated," Jacob interjected, opening the metal box and withdrawing a thick folder. "These are the original engineering reports from the bridge construction filed with the State Commission in 1882. They show that the iron used in the bridge met all safety specifications according to the testing procedures available at that time." Blackwood's face had grown dangerously red. "Marshal, this is clearly an attempt to obstruct justice. These so-called original documents could have been forged just as easily as any others." "That's true," Marshal Hayes admitted. But he was moving toward Jacob to examine the documents despite Blackwood's protests. "However, I'm beginning to wonder why this case was rushed through federal channels so quickly without allowing time for a proper investigation." Clara seized the opening. "Marshal, there's something else you should know about Mr. Blackwood's motives. His son Henry didn't die in the bridge collapse as he's claimed. Henry Blackwood died of pneumonia in 1882, a full year before the bridge accident. Jacob found his grave marker in the Sage Creek Cemetery. The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the sound of Blackwood's sharp intake of breath. Marshal Hayes turned to face the older man, his hand moving unconsciously toward the gun at his hip. "Mr. Blackwood, is this accusation true?" It's irrelevant," Blackwood stammered, his carefully constructed facade finally beginning to crumble. "The deaths of innocent people in that bridge collapse still demand justice, regardless of my personal losses. But if your son didn't die in the bridge collapse, then your entire motivation for pursuing this case is based on a lie," Hayes pointed out with the logic of a man accustomed to sorting truth from deception. Why would you fabricate such an elaborate story unless you had something to gain from Mr. Wellington's conviction? Thomas stepped forward, seeing an opportunity to present the truth he had been defending. Marshall, Cornelius Blackwood owns the Texas Central Railroad, which has been competing with Wellington Pacific for the same shipping contracts and rights of way. If I'm convicted and my assets are seized, he'll be in a position to acquire my railroad at a fraction of its true value. These are desperate accusations from a desperate man, Blackwood protested, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. Marshal Hayes, I must remind you that you have a federal warrant. I have a piece of paper, Hayes corrected firmly, and I'm beginning to suspect that piece of paper was obtained through false pretenses. He turned to Clara, his expression gentling slightly. Miss Wellington, you were present when your father made the decisions regarding the bridge construction. Can you provide any testimony about his knowledge of potential safety issues? Clara felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. Everything depended on what she said next: her father's freedom, Jacob's future, and the truth that had been buried under layers of deception and revenge. Marshall, I was 15 years old when the bridge was built, and I didn't have direct knowledge of the construction details. But I can tell you about my father's character, about the kind of man who would spend 3 years sending money to the families affected by the accident, not to buy their silence, but because he genuinely felt responsible for their losses. Money that was sent secretly, Jacob added, his voice carrying the weight of newfound understanding. Money that came with no conditions, no requests for silence, no legal agreements. Just monthly payments to help me rebuild my life after losing my parents. Marshal Hayes was examining the documents Jacob had provided, comparing them to copies of the reports Blackwood had submitted. Even Clara could see the differences: subtle variations in letterhead design, slight discrepancies in formatting, and most tellingly, signatures that didn't quite match when held up to the light. Mr. Blackwood, Hayes said finally, his voice carrying the authority of federal law, I'm going to need you to explain how you obtained these documents and why they appear to differ substantially from the original reports filed with the State Railroad Commission. But Blackwood was no longer listening. His eyes had taken on the wild look of a cornered animal, and his hand was moving toward something concealed beneath his coat. You don't understand, he said, his voice rising to a near shout. Thomas Wellington has been bleeding this state dry for years. His railroads, his lumber mills, his cattle operations, he's built an empire on the graves of working men, and somebody has to stop him. By framing him for crimes he didn't commit? Clara asked, her voice steady despite the danger she could see building in Blackwood's expression. By any means necessary. Blackwood pulled a small derringer from his coat, the nickel-plated weapon gleaming in the morning sunlight. Marshal, I'm placing these people under citizen's arrest for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. I demand that you support my authority in this matter. Marshal Hayes's own gun was in his hand before Blackwood finished speaking, trained steadily on the older man's chest. Mr. Blackwood, I'm ordering you to drop your weapon and submit to questioning about your role in fabricating evidence in this case. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Clara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears and feel Jacob's tension radiating from across the room. Her father remained perfectly still beside her, but she could sense the coiled energy in his body, ready to throw himself between the gun and his daughter at the first sign of danger. You're all fools, Blackwood said finally, but his gun hand was beginning to tremble. Wellington destroyed my business, ruined my reputation, drove me to the edge of bankruptcy. Everything I built, everything I worked for, turned to dust because of his success, and you want to protect him? I want to protect the truth, Marshal Hayes replied firmly. Now, drop the gun. Blackwood's derringer clattered to the floor, and with it fell the elaborate web of lies and forged documents that had nearly destroyed the Wellington family. As Marshal Hayes moved to place handcuffs on the broken man, Clara finally understood the full scope of what had almost happened. Her father's love, expressed through actions she hadn't understood, had saved not just her life but her family's entire future. Thomas Wellington pulled his daughter close, and for the first time in months, Clara felt truly safe in her father's embrace. The ordeal was over. The truth had emerged, and the bonds between them, strained nearly to breaking but never quite severed, had proven strong enough to withstand even the most elaborate deception. Outside the office windows, the sun climbed higher over the Texas prairie, painting the railroad tracks in shades of gold and promise. The future stretched ahead like those gleaming rails, uncertain but full of possibility for a family that had rediscovered the power of love and truth to overcome even the darkest of times. The autumn of 1885 brought changes to Dustwood that would be remembered for generations. Thomas Wellington stood on the platform of the newly completed railroad station, watching his daughter Clara step down from the train that had carried her back from her honeymoon in San Francisco. The young woman who emerged bore little resemblance to the frightened, self-doubting girl who had once collapsed in the railroad yard. At a healthy weight of 140 pounds, Clara moved with confidence and grace, her hand resting protectively on the gentle swell of her pregnancy while Jacob helped her navigate the platform steps. "Welcome home, Mrs. Morrison," Thomas said, embracing his daughter with the easy affection that had taken months to rebuild after the terrible misunderstandings that had nearly torn their family apart. The title still sounded strange to his ears, but he had grown to love the way Clara's eyes lit up whenever someone used her married name. "It's good to be back, Father," Clara replied, squeezing his hand with genuine warmth. "Though I have to admit, I missed the sound of the trains. San Francisco was beautiful, but it didn't feel like home." Jacob approached carrying their luggage, his blacksmith's hands now bearing a simple gold wedding band that caught the Texas sunlight. The months since Cornelius Blackwood's arrest and trial had transformed him as well, erasing the bitter lines around his eyes and replacing them with the contentment of a man who had found his place in the world. His blacksmith shop had expanded into a full metalworking business with contracts to provide specialized components for the Wellington Pacific Railroad. "Mr. Wellington," Jacob said, extending his hand to his father-in-law with the respect that had grown between them over the past year. "The business ran smoothly while we were away?" "Better than smoothly," Thomas replied with genuine pride. "Dr. Hayes tells me the new safety protocols you designed for the bridge construction have been adopted by 3 other railroad companies. Your parents would be proud of the man you've become, Jacob." The mention of Jacob's parents no longer carried the weight of guilt and misunderstanding that had once poisoned their relationship. The truth about the bridge collapse had been thoroughly investigated following Blackwood's arrest, and Jacob had played a crucial role in designing improved safety standards that would prevent similar tragedies in the future. His parents' deaths, while still a source of sorrow, had been transformed from a source of bitter revenge into a motivation for positive change. As they walked through the bustling streets of Dustwood, Clara marveled at the transformation that had taken place during her absence. The town had grown from a rough frontier settlement into a proper community, with a new school, a library funded by the Wellington family, and even a small hospital where Dr. Hayes could provide more comprehensive medical care. The railroad yard hummed with activity, but now the workers labored under improved conditions with better safety equipment and fair wages. "There's something I want to show you," Thomas said as they approached the newly constructed town square. In the center stood a monument of polished granite, its surface bearing the names of all those who had died in railroad accidents throughout Texas, including Jacob's parents, Michael and Sarah Morrison. But this was not a memorial born of guilt or obligation. It was a celebration of lives that had contributed to the building of a better future. Clara read the inscription aloud, her voice thick with emotion. in memory of those whose sacrifice built the roads that connect us all. Their legacy lives on in every mile of track that brings families together. Below the main inscription, in smaller letters, she found the dedication, erected by the Wellington Pacific Railroad and the Morrison Foundation for Railroad Safety. The Morrison Foundation? Clara looked at Jacob with surprise and pride. Your husband has been busy while you were planning the wedding, Thomas explained with a smile. Half the compensation money I paid him over the years went into establishing a fund to improve safety conditions for railroad workers across the state. The other half funded the training program that's already graduated 15 new safety inspectors. Jacob shifted uncomfortably under their praise, his natural modesty making it difficult for him to accept recognition for work he considered simply the right thing to do. My parents died because we didn't know enough about safe construction practices. If what we've learned can save other families from going through what I experienced, then their deaths weren't meaningless. They spent the afternoon visiting the various improvements that had been made to the town, including the expansion of the school where Clara had volunteered to teach advanced mathematics and literature. The irony was not lost on any of them that the same education her father had once encouraged, then seemed to dismiss during those terrible months of misunderstanding, was now being shared with children who might never have had such opportunities. As evening approached, they gathered for dinner in the Wellington family home, where the formal dining room had been opened for the first time since Margaret Wellington's death 18 years earlier. The table that had once seemed too large for their small family now accommodated not just Thomas, Clara, and Jacob, but also Dr. Hayes, Foreman Mackenzie, and several of the families whose children attended Clara's classes. The conversation flowed easily around topics of community development, railroad expansion, and the upcoming birth of Clara and Jacob's first child. Dr. Hayes had confirmed that Clara's pregnancy was progressing normally, with none of the complications that had claimed her mother's life. The improved understanding of medical care combined with Clara's excellent health following her weight loss gave everyone confidence that this birth would mark a joyful beginning rather than another tragic loss. "Have you chosen names yet?" asked Mrs. Henderson from the general store, her curiosity reflecting the entire town's investment in the young couple's happiness. Clara and Jacob exchanged glances, sharing one of those wordless communications that had become second nature to them. "If it's a boy, we'd like to name him Thomas Michael Morrison," Clara announced, causing her father to set down his coffee cup with a trembling hand. "Thomas for my father, and Michael for Jacob's father. And if it's a girl," Dr. Hayes prompted gently. "Margaret Sarah Morrison," Jacob replied, his voice carrying the weight of honoring both their mothers. "We want our children to understand where they came from and the sacrifices that made their lives possible." Thomas excused himself from the table, stepping out onto the front porch where the evening breeze carried the sounds of a thriving community settling into night. The railroad yard was quiet now, its workers having returned to comfortable homes with their families, far different from the rough bunkhouses and dangerous conditions that had once characterized frontier railroad construction. Clara joined him on the porch, settling into the rocking chair that had been her mother's favorite spot for watching the sunset. The physical resemblance between mother and daughter was unmistakable, but Clara had developed a strength and confidence that Margaret had never possessed, forged through trials that would have broken a weaker spirit. "Do you think she would be proud of us?" Clara asked, her hand resting on her growing belly. "Mother, I mean, do you think she would approve of the choices we've made?" Thomas considered the question carefully, as he did all matters relating to his late wife's memory. "Your mother wanted 3 things above all else: for you to be healthy, for you to be happy, and for you to find someone who would love you for exactly who you are. Looking at you now, I think she would be more than proud. I think she would be amazed at the woman you've become." Jacob appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light spilling from the house. The doctor says the baby should arrive sometime in February, right around the anniversary of when your father and I first started working together on the safety protocols. New beginnings, Clara mused, rocking gently in her mother's chair. It seems fitting somehow that our child will be born at the start of spring, when everything is growing and full of promise. As the three of them sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge over the Texas prairie, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The months of anguish when he had forced himself to be cruel in order to save his daughter's life, the terrible misunderstandings that had nearly torn them apart, the web of lies and revenge that had threatened to destroy everything they held dear, all of it had led to this evening of perfect contentment. The love between a father and daughter, tested by deception and strengthened by truth, had proven more resilient than the iron rails that crossed the continent. And in the end, that love had not only saved Clara's life, but had created a foundation strong enough to support generations of happiness yet to come. In the distance, the whistle of the evening freight train echoed across the prairie, its sound no longer a reminder of loss and separation, but a promise that tomorrow would bring new opportunities for growth, connection, and the kind of love that endures beyond all understanding. The rails that Thomas Wellington had laid across Texas would carry freight and passengers for decades to come, but his greatest legacy was sitting beside him, preparing to welcome the next generation of a family built on truth, forgiveness, and the unshakable bonds of unconditional love. Sometimes, the greatest love appears disguised as harshness, and the deepest wounds can become the foundation for our strongest bonds. Clara and Thomas Wellington's story reminds us that families can survive the most devastating misunderstandings when truth and genuine love finally break through the barriers of pride and pain. In our own lives, how many relationships have we written off too quickly? How many times have we mistaken someone's desperate attempt to help for deliberate cruelty? This Texas family's journey from heartbreak to healing shows us that it's never too late to rebuild trust, seek understanding, and choose love over bitterness. Their second chance came through facing hard truths and choosing forgiveness, a reminder that our own relationships deserve that same courage and grace. What relationship in your life could benefit from a deeper understanding of the other person's true motivations? Have you ever discovered that someone's seemingly harsh actions were actually born from love and concern for your well-being?